Welcome to How Whiteness Eclipses Accuracy in the Clinic and Beyond. My name is Alexa Miller. I founded Arts Practica, which is my consultancy, in 2011 out of real concern about the way in which uncertainty is managed and approached in medicine, and to bring adaptive strategies for approaching uncertainty into medicine from my own research, reviewing best practices of doctors, as well as other fields like the arts, where uncertainty is approached very differently. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. But in recent years, racism, white supremacy, and its insidious influences in uncertainty have just become clearer and clearer to me as part of this work. And so I've been working in my own personal learning trajectory as a teacher and a human being, and also on a scholarly level and in my teaching and workshops. I wanted to share that a little bit. And I'm so excited to also present with Dr. Callie Cyrus, who is a friend and an incredible colleague, and somebody whose our friendship has been an important driver in my own learning over the years. And she is just such an expert on DEI and racism in society and in medicine and in academic contexts. So Callie and I are each going to talk about our work, and I'm going to go first. But I just wanted to tell you all how excited I am to do this together. And we've worked together in a few different contexts. And we're also still exploring ways in which our work is synergistic. So we would love to hear from you about the themes that you notice and similarities in our work and connections that you see as well as we go, because selfishly, we're doing this conversation a little bit for us to explore crossover of our work and also share it with you and invite your questions and on the ground experiences. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, I know many of you already know me, but for those who don't, this is what I do. This is what I have been doing for about 17 years, which is teaching groups of medical teams, clinicians, mostly focused on doctors, but working with clinicians broadly, talking about what they see in an art museum setting to improve that communication and diagnostic skill, and also to facilitate a shared concept of uncertainty. So in medicine, uncertainty is very frequently viewed as a drain or sometimes a conflicted space, like a battleground even. But in works of art, uncertainty can be places where the risk and the conflict is decreased, which makes it easier to take the interpersonal risks that allow us to see that uncertainty is actually a place for hope and for learning, and something that's often the reality and something that we really need to be able to evolve as a species and create knowledge and see the whole picture together. There's a whole lot more to say about uncertainty, but what I wanted to mention for today is that uncertainty is a place where things in medicine can go really, really well, like the best of medicine can get made and co-produced with patients and families and team members, or where things can go very badly. And if you talk to patient safety experts and people who study medical cases that have gone very wrong, a common theme across the board of these experts, who often don't agree with each other on other things, is that all human beings involved in care need to be much better equipped in uncertainty. So uncertainty is also a place that's very subject to influence and distortions. And typically, I'm going to come back to that. Typically, when we talk about those influences, we talk about the things like incentive programs or prescribing or technology, burnout, stress states, organizational culture. These are the things that are typically talked about as the influences in uncertainty. And what the last year, and I mean more, it's been so long documented since like forever, but what the last year it has forced and not allowed a looking away from the extent to which the overarching divisions of our society, in which the United States was built when we went and got slaves from other countries to build our economy and created a system of who benefits and who pays. that basic overarching racist structure, and also the culture around it that's dynamic with it, the white supremacy culture, are just insidious influences and uncertainty. So I've been really focusing on that for myself, for my own learning, and more as a teacher. I certainly don't see myself as an expert. I can't work with an institution to transform their belonging and their approach to racism in the way that Callie can and does and will speak to. And in fact, I've had the privilege of just coming in a small way to some of Callie's work at other sites, and hearing from the people she's worked with about just like how effective it is. So I'm really excited to have her share. I'll just talk a little bit about a little bit of the teaching that I've been doing that can advance the work of institutions that are already engaged in work like that, such as Callie does, or other other consultants, institutions that are honorably taking on examining their supremacist roots and how to recreate a better way. So this is a work of art by Thornton Dial, who is a self-taught African-American artist. It's an incredible piece. I've talked about it many, many times in different discussions. I know others here on the session have too. Actually, let's throw in the chat. We're not going to stop and do an image discussion, as fun as that would be, but let's start throwing in the chat some of the themes that you think might come up from this work of art. Like just one or two words. What themes jump out at you? Now I have to figure out how to pull. Okay, great. So you see violence, bloodshed, chaos. Love it. Yeah, all of these things. I had a conversation about this just the other day with some students, and they were all over the place as to the significance and was it American flag or was it not? And then somebody just finally said, you know what, this is just a pile of trash. Okay, these are great. Messy cohesion, confusion, muddlement, wonderful. So we could go on and on and on, and another time and place we will. But one of the things that I use this work of art to bring up is the idea of is freedom. Freedom is, when we talk about freedom and the American ideal of freedom, we don't always think about that we're actually talking about safety. Safety is freedom. Safety is freedom from harm. One of the great privileges and most protected resources of a white supremacist thought system is the privilege, the entitlement to have freedom, while at the same time staying willfully ignorant of the harm that causes others and others' inability to have that safety. So that's a big concept. We're going to bookmark it for now, but that I use this work of art as a jumping off point to talk about that. Another thing I use it to have a jumping off point is to just talk about culture. Culture, we can define it as the medium in which we come up, in which we grow. Culture reflects our values. It's like a mirror. And it is the author, Tima Okun, who writes about white supremacy culture, whose work I would very highly recommend. And when I'm done with this presentation, I'll drop some links in the chat. But she talks about how central to the idea of culture is a survival strategy. And in white supremacy culture, it's a kill or be killed. It's a better than, rather than an equal human partnership, the work of affiliation or brotherhood. And culture is also like, you can think of like the fish, saying, how's the water? And the fish going, what's the water? We don't often think about culture. There's so much we take it for granted that we accept as part of our survival strategy in a certain system. So here are some of the things that are in the water of US culture, the things we typically don't stop to think about. Healthcare being the #1 cause of bankruptcy, for example. I could get sick tomorrow and need a major, life-saving intervention and be homeless next year. We're costing the earth. We have this pandemic of racism that we have had for 400 years, though within the last year, we finally have medical groups and others acknowledging that. Prevalent discrimination and violence. I mean, I'm not going to go into these things. I'm sure you have all seen just the staggering data that's coming out on the discrimination and the disparities that we see in health as part of things we accept as normal, okay? And so this is informed by a mythology. So what is mythology, right? You're asking an arts and humanities person. So mythology is about the sacred stories, like going back to that picture of our flag, our sacred stories of American ideals. The mythology behind that is, express our beliefs and values held within a certain culture. And so that mythology is, coming from white supremacy, which is a huge topic. I'm going to talk in the most simple terms and very briefly, but there's a lot more to say about it. But sort of on the outer crust of it, coming from 18th century Enlightenment ideas that falsely separated the idea of reason from emotion. And categorized people by a false sense of status, including with animals, and really made a sort of false, taxonomy of belonging, and that these ideals fed right into industry. And cost, which is part of why a basic way in which, like, we look now at our industry costing lives and the planet, primarily. Beneath that and undergirding that, before the 18th century, we can point to the book of Genesis and the idea of the creation of Eve, as somebody who is, not also a protagonist like Adam, who's in the center, but a helpmate and maybe somebody to blame. These ideas of one human being better than another, and the different roles that get assigned. Embedded in these ideas are, there's violence and pleasure and the confusion of the two. And so the scholarship of Resmaa Menakem talks about this really well, and I highly recommend his book, My Grandmother's Hands. But the linkage of the traumas that came out of the medieval era and the public floggings and the torture chambers, this is from the Tower of London, that those confusions and those twisted qualities of pleasure and violence came from that era, and that we've never fully recovered, and we've never gotten over that, and we project it and distort it. And we see that all the time in movies. Like, you have a sex scene or a rape scene right next to a violent scene. So there's like a conscientious confusion of those feelings even now in our pop culture. So the author, Eddie Glaude, who has an incredible book on the work of James Baldwin, has this great concept of the bribe, which he describes as like the acceptance of the white supremacist culture, really that survive as a survival strategy. And he said, there's a beautiful podcast, I'll post a link to it, where he's talking about his book, but it's white people's silence. It's that acceptance. You just do your job and you make your money, and the real worst part of you're causing harm and maintaining that willful ignorance, but to adjust oneself to that is damage to oneself. James Baldwin had this famous quote, I think it was in 1968 with Rolling Stone, about how he was asked, well, aren't you concerned about Black people? And he said, actually, I mean, we're dying, but we're just the ones dying faster. Everybody's dying of this distortion. And Glaude talks about that the bribe involves a deformation of attention. We leave our eyes blank if you accept it. And so when I first heard that, it really stopped me in my tracks, and it like connected all these dots that I want to share with you, the deformation of attention. I first thought about Oscar Wilde's philosophical novel about the picture of Dorian Gray, when somebody he previously admired and then started having worse and worse feelings about actually became deformed and distorted in his perception. I was really into the work of the German Expressionists when I first started studying art. And there's an interesting body of work that comes out of Germany between the wars that really documents that sadistic smile that you see in the Nazis. So this is Max Beckmann of the Hitler Youth, and you just see that real sicko smile that we see all the time. It's no different from the smile on Derek Chauvin's face as he was killing George Floyd. It reminded me of stereotype threat. So the work of Claude Steele, who identified stereotype threat and how Black boys are perceived as a threat around age 5. And this is a wonderful book about his research and his personal life that led to it. The Bribe reminded me of physician burnout and what it's like, seeing so many of my friends who are doctors who are seeing friends of theirs take their own lives, and the moral distress that so many physicians are under, sort of being part of this system that they see causing harm all the time and being really haunted by seeing terrible things. It reminded me of my friend Callie, and when Callie and I first met at Yale, and I saw her interact with colleagues who I thought I knew really well, and be treated herself like a threat in ways that when I observed her personally being extremely generous. And I saw that distortion in action with Callie. Jonathan Metzl's work, Dying of Whiteness. So, and finally, it reminded me of the epidemic of misdiagnosis, which is something I have studied for many years, and how errors themselves are one of the reasons why errors are interesting is they tell us information about a system. So I'm going to end by just talking a little bit about errors in medicine. So this is a list from the research of Pat Crosscarry, who is a world expert on medical error. And this is a list of the most common cognitive causes of error in misdiagnosis. I'm not going to describe what each and every one of them is, but for those of you who are in medicine, you're probably aware of them. But they are all different kinds of cognitive tendencies. And I also just want to say to those of you who are in medicine, cognitive errors and racism also are not people being bad people. One of the most important pieces of learning in my own personal journey was reading the work of Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility. And one of the brilliant things about that book is it takes the moral crisis out of racism. So it makes it okay and safe to say, yes, I'm a racist. I grew up in a racist culture. I'm saying racist things. Let me notice that and take it back and deconstruct it, but not have to have a huge emotional breakdown that's actually going to derail the conversation and protect racism. So this is not about doctors being bad people at all. And I just want to say, everybody who showed up on this call who is a doctor, you're awesome. And thanks for exploring this. But those deformations of attention, there are aspects of the white supremacy mythology that I can see at play in some of these errors in key ways. So overconfidence is like preferring having false certainty over accurate uncertainty, which is very unsafe. That's about needing to be right and taking the satisfaction of being better than or smarter than other people. The use of myth or stereotype instead of reliable data. This is so prevalent in medical education, the confusion of phenotypes and stereotypes, where data just doesn't exist. And most phenotypes are based on white male specimens. And there's so much in medicine that is simply not known about how diseases present and express in bodies of color. And that is often treated, gaps are often sort of filled in with stereotypes or just illusions or distortions in ways that are completely inappropriate. There is some really interesting work being done right now to build out that body of knowledge, but that willful ignorance is still very prevalent. And then lastly, I actually just mentioned this, but fragility, taking input as a threat and having a lot of shame and like alarm bells going off instead of logically and reasonably learning from it, and failure to disclose the learnings that come from failure. Again, this is not just people being fragile and terrible and bad. A lot of this is systems that are coming from a very defensive place and don't support this kind of work. But I wanted to sort of point out these common themes as a way to open up this topic and start a conversation. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Callie, and I'll drop some links in the chat as we go, but thank you.
All right, thank you, Alexa. And so as I share my screen, I think about the title of How Whiteness Eclipses Accuracy in the Clinic and Beyond, and how Alexa and I, we approach a similar issue in different ways. I tend to be, maybe my end of what I like to talk about is more on the highlighting what that whiteness looks like from the perspective of other people. And so that's a little bit about, you'll see my style and you'll be able to tell the difference between Alexa and I, but how we're really highlighting the same issues, which is how problematic unexamined whiteness can be and how it does lead to inaccurate perceptions and decision-making. So again, I want to tell you a little bit about what I do now, why I do this work, and how, if at all, I think that I'm actually helping people. And then we'll move into the Q&A, which is, I think, a part that is maybe going to be a little bit more helpful. So what I do, so first of all, I am a board certified private practice psychiatrist. I don't know that I say the private practice with pride, but I work for myself and I no longer really work at a clinic that's affiliated with academia in that sort of way. So I'm definitely out on my own doing the kind of entrepreneur thing. But I'm also working as a DEI consultant. So I see patients a couple of days a week, and then I work with organizations, some smaller, some larger, and developing more long-term programs that explore issues related to difference. So I'm not talking like an implicit bias one-off workshop. I'm talking like a 10-week intensive program with homework, and everybody works together on a Zoom doing activities and talking about really tough issues as a group. So to really strengthen your teamwork and your approach as an organization. And then I'm also an activist. Whether or not some of these organizations are still really around and how much they're doing, I've been part of them in some different ways, or using them as a vehicle to get ideas out about, how important examining whiteness and how much that not examining it can hurt people who look like me. And again, I do some stuff with academia, but it's clearly complicated. So I'll get to this later. But yes, I do still do some education. And unfortunately, fortunately, I still really enjoy it, even if it's unpaid, which is a new thing. I'm not going to go into my personal life struggle with money right now, but it's tough to be, I miss academia in some ways anyway. So why I do it. This is perhaps the more important part of it. And well, to be honest, because of mommy issues. Most of the time when you ask a psychiatrist why they went into being a doctor, they give you some reason, but at the heart, it's usually mommy or daddy issues. So on the left is me. I think very adorable, even with the chiclet teeth, born in 1984, 80s baby. And on the right is my mother, Geraldine, who is a character and a force in my life. So one thing you probably notice is a difference in where we were raised. I was raised in very sunny West Palm Beach, diverse for the most part, in suburbia, a magnet high school in the 80s, and my mother in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s in South Carolina. So you can imagine the difference in what messages my mother received about who she was as a Black woman versus the messages I may be receiving from my environment. And take it one step further and think about what kind of messages then my mother might be telling me to protect me. So one of those might be careful around white people, which I think for some might be new, but this is a common thing that people of color tell their kids. It's like, don't trust white people, be careful around them. White people will underestimate you, which was her experience growing up and working and always being the only Black person in some of her circles, which unfortunately still happens with me today. But it's something that can really take its toll on your sense of self-efficacy. And then also help people who look like you first and foremost. So this was literally the refrain from my mother, K through 12, until I was able to get out of there. So being the rebellious, independent thinker that I am, I was like, I'm gonna grow up and I'm gonna prove my mom wrong, and I'm gonna give everybody. And I'm gonna assume that they're well-meaning white people, and I'm gonna give them all a chance. So, I believe that you could be friends with people who were very different. Right. I also believe that, I wanted to be a doctor. And that meant that my value was that I had to want to treat everybody, including people who were very different from me or I wouldn't normally want to treat. That's also part of my mindset. But I also believe that if I could love different people, so could others. After making so many friendships and relationships with people who are so different from me, finding some common thread and some reason to actually trust them in a different way. So why can't everyone do that? And that's some of what shaped my interest in working in academia, wanting to teach and come up with interesting curriculum around diversity and difference. And I mean, this is the way that I traversed the world, which was in some ways really glorious. And then an event happened that happened to everybody, even our UK folks, right? You guys experienced some of the repercussions of this as well. But it just, it really, really shook me in a different way. I wasn't surprised by the election, but what ended up happening, it was the election plus everything that happened afterwards. It was just like a constant beating down of those idealistic values, I'll call them, that I had really endorsed most of my life while seeing some of the ugly, but really believing that I could help address some of the ugly. And then, I fell into this space where it was a dark place. I realized how right my mother was, which is something that I don't like to admit, but there is some truth in that. And that I really can't trust most white people because they or their families elected Trump. And this is a statement that, I even a little uncomfortable to say out loud, but I say it because I know it's in this crowd, I will say, right? Callie behind the computer is different than Callie in the streets. But this is the way that I operate in the world and even professionally, is that I know I have to watch my back. And a lot of the time doesn't even matter if you're white, it's just in general. People right now we're all trying to stay afloat. But then I just kept coming back to this, well, then how are so many people who might be connected to family members who voted for Trump still my friends? Like friends that I trust, friends that I know would have my back if we were in a restaurant and something went down, or we were on the streets and something went down, that they would fight to help me, which is something that's still very, it's a dissonance that I'm still trying to piece together. So basically, I left Yale. I stopped doing DEI. It was really incredibly hard to do it. I just didn't believe in it. And I started doing other stuff. I had to rebuild my hopes somehow. So I worked on the Hill. I took a fellowship working with the APA. So I worked with the Connecticut Junior Senator Chris Murphy for an entire year doing health policy work, which was a great transition, even though I learned that I don't like working 9 to 5 behind a cubicle. So that was nice to kind of rule that out as a next step. I also entered into a safe relationship with another academic institution. So again, rebuilding safety in my own terms, right? So finding ways that I can trust people, even if they don't look like me. So again, I want to make sure I emphasize this difference. So even if I traverse the world not trusting most white people, I see things in more of a one-on-one kind of, you get to know a group, you build that trust with people. That is always possible to me. And so I'm an assistant professor at Hopkins. I'm part-time and unsalaried, and it's a great relationship. I do enjoy my interactions that I have with them and my clinical opportunities that I'm able to have with them, and also conversations. But I think what ended up happening is that I needed to, over the years, come to terms with my DEI interests, which has led me to this point where I am really diving into the private practice, but also this model where I'm working with groups and also doing a bit of, I call it like psychological coaching, basically. So talking about race in an out of the box way, because I like that model of working with people. But the difference is that I'm no longer optimistic, which, this was a very big kind of conflict. My partner kept saying to me, oh, well, you thought you were woke and you didn't get woke until the Trump thing happened. I was like, no, that's not really, doesn't capture the nuance, which no one likes being told that they're not as woke as they think they were. But I realized that there was an optimism that I possess that I no longer possess, but what I do have is hope. And so I put this on here just to highlight that difference, because I think that, I think we get down on ourselves when we don't have optimism, but remember that we do have hope, which is like, I'm going to do this regardless, because I do think my actions are effective in some way, and I'm just going to continue doing it. So there must be something that's helping me. And I think that it's hope, which I have, which is why I do this work. So then, okay, how, if at all, I think I can help, which is why we're doing this talk, which is why we're going to do some Q&A. It's just to sort of showcase how Alexa and I think about these issues in terms of their practicality. And I think that's where I'm headed, is really trying to be practical. So I think I can help, one, because I offer a number of formats, and that is, again, the one-on-one coaching. If you have some kind of questions that you don't feel comfortable asking someone else, you don't want to put that burden on your Black friends or colleagues, that's something that's a labor that I can do. Curriculum development, informal conversations, there are other arrangements. And I also take a sort of, I call it a triple threat approach, but I've always tried to target the Callie in an audience, the one who's going to be distracted on her phone doing something else. So I try to make the material really sticky and practical. So tips that you can actually carry forward. There's no formula to, curing racism or being less of a racist, but there are some strategies you can develop. And so in that vein, that's why I was shifted to doing workshops and coaching and working with groups so that I can make them customized. So I can understand what your organization day to day are like. What is the job descriptions of these different positions, and actually fine tune the material so that you understand how your actions might result in harm to a marginalized identity in a way that you really understand. And also scholarly, which is something I thank academia for, which is I use evidence, which is really important to guide whatever these types of efforts that you are doing. I also think I can help because, again, I'm choosing who I want to work with. And I think by virtue of you, everyone who's on here right now, I think you fall into this category, which is that, I choose to work with individuals or groups who are intrinsically motivated, which is, per the literature, one thing that can help reduce your bias, your implicit bias against others who did not look like you, versus external motivation, which is like this desire to look good in public. That intrinsic motivation is like what makes you join a conference call at 12 o'clock on a Friday when you could be out in the sun or doing something else. So I want to work with people who are motivated and do this process in a different kind of way. And most importantly, it's on my own terms. It's not the way that I was doing it in academia. And I know it's not my job to save white people, which is why I wouldn't offer my help if I thought that was the case. And for whatever reason, I don't know, I actually enjoy it, which is weird. I just do, right? I know one of the problems that we assume all Black people want to talk about diversity, which isn't true. I just happen to like this stuff. It's weird, bottom line. I mean, money is also involved in it too, but it is a weird thing to like to do. So bottom line is, if this seems up your alley at some point, together or separately, Alexa and I offer a range of different things for organizations, targeted workshops, small group course, if you know that there's a group of people who would be interested in having some really frank conversations and navigating some of these really tough issues, or just individually, just, that's out there. And then we're going to dive into the Q&A and show you a bit of a sampling of our work. So one thing I want to do is I'll start out with a question. It's 12:38. And then I'll show you how I would answer this question if this was in a workshop. And then I'm going to send you all a link in the chat to a list of potential questions if you don't have any. Or you can ask whatever questions you might have that you would like us to comment on. And then you can also, if you prefer, ask it anonymously. But I think we're a small group and you guys have been pretty active in the chat. So maybe we'll just use the chat, but I'll just dive in. So here is an example of a case scenario that I would include in a grand rounds or in a group meeting as part of a module on a specific topic. And so, dear Dr. Callie, let's say someone in the audience asked this anonymously or, with their name. I'm trying to be a white ally, but I feel like I'm coming up short. Nothing I do seems to be the right thing. For example, I texted my BIPOC friend about the Chauvin verdict and later found out that it was upsetting to them. So again, this is the kind of stuff that I think we really need to be talking about in a direct way. And it's hard to talk about this stuff. Who do you ask this to? Do you ask, I'm making a lot of assumptions here. Let me name this. I'm not a white person. So I don't fully know what it is like to be a white ally. Maybe Alexa will comment on this at some point, but I know that this is something that's happening because it happened to me. I received multiple text messages. Let's celebrate. This is great. Oh my God, finally. And I can't say that I enjoyed those text messages. And so what do you what do you do if this happened to you? How do you think about it? What do you learn, and how do you not feel discouraged or scared, right? Like, that's the thing. Am I going to get canceled? There's so many mistakes that you can make. So I'll explain at least how I think about answering this question in a way that I hope is educational, but also practical. So the answer is, I mean, it's definitely complicated, but I think one word is just remember that you have privilege if you are a white ally. Like, at the end of the day, I don't know how many articles on bias, on being an ally, on how to advocate for people who don't look like you, on like organizational psychology, and like, how do you change your brain loops so that they don't reinforce you doing stereotypes and bias, but it always comes down to acknowledging your privilege. Obviously, it's more complicated than that in this context that we're talking about, because it's a complicated kind of issue. But the privilege, and so in thinking about the answer to this, it is a specific type of privilege. So in looking at these text messages, I'll explain it from my point of view. I saw "let's celebrate." This is great. And I know the data, which is at least that when folks are surveying white people, it is often the case that white people tend to overestimate racial progress. So in seeing a verdict of guilty, which in itself is a good thing, it's a landmark court decision. I am aware intellectually that that should be celebrated in some respect. But what I don't see is progress. What I see is that same day, we had a 16-year-old who was shot by the police. Yes, she was wielding a knife, but do we think about Kyle Rittenhouse with a semi-automatic weapon, who was welcomed and peaceably arrested, and then even had a Virginia police officer who donated to his like release fund or something, or some other release fund, something like that. And so what I see is how much more there is to do. I think about all the people who were shot last week. I think about all the names that we are going to continue to hear. And I think about that because I look like these people. The moment I leave my house, I'm acutely aware that I look like somebody, no matter that I'm a doctor and I have my own privilege, that I can get shot. And so when I hear the verdict, to be honest, I didn't feel anything. I'd already kind of detached from this whole Chauvin thing. So you can imagine that this is already a difference that I don't know that you can fully understand, because it's just the way that I inhabit the world that is different from a person who is white. And that's going to be the case. And so understanding that as a background of why someone might be upset doesn't necessarily mean they're upset at you, right? But upset about, how different you can be perceiving something that is, I guess, monumental, kind of like the election of Obama and racism is done, this kind of thing. So this is one way that I would look at it. So I also, at this point in my talks, usually start talking about privilege, right? Which tends to make people feel a little bit icky. So icky that there's even a model that was developed to help people talk about privilege and recognize, why it is so hard, right? So because of denial, deflection, rationalization, these are all the ways that we defend against someone talking about privilege, because we think that they're saying we've gotten something that we don't deserve. And that's not necessarily what I'm talking about. It's tied up in a bunch of other themes, and we all have privilege in some sort of way. So it's a complex issue. And this is one that I think is really important to know how to talk about in a way that doesn't make people shut down, because it's actually really important to be able to have this conversation. So one of the ways that I think about privilege that I think helps is I think about it as access to resources. So not necessarily that you don't deserve where you're at or that you're benefiting every day, which some of that is a little true, right? Is that we benefit from invisible privileges, the more characteristics we take on that represent whiteness, right? So the fact that I have an MD, the fact that I am upper middle class, the fact that I grew up middle class, right? These are all things that are privileges to me and gave me access to, or my parents access to employment, gave me access to housing in a safe neighborhood in West Palm Beach, gave me access to education, not necessarily my parents, gave me access to all these things that allowed me to get into Stanford, that allowed me to get into medical school, that allowed me to thrive in medical school, to have the social capital, to know how to talk to people and feel comfortable in myself, to put myself out there. So this brings me to the next point, which is always important when you're talking about privilege. You don't just talk about it in isolation. You talk about intersectionality, which is another one of these buzzwords. But it's really important because we're not just one thing, right? I am a Black, queer, androgynous, woman with some really bad anxiety who's always sleepy. And these might happen to be part of my oppressed identities. But again, I also have a lot of privileged identities. As I mentioned in the slide before, so many privileges that I have that somebody else doesn't have to deal with. And so I like to say that if you're not quite sure where you fit on this is a really good depiction by Sylvia Duckworth. She's an educator who makes illustrations like this, is the power and privilege wheel of, how close you are to the inner circle really determines how much power you have in society, which does determine how successful you are in terms of the characteristics that help you move forward versus some out here. So if you're struggling and trying to figure out, what are your intersectional identities, this is a really good way of looking at it and seeing how many privileged identities you might have versus marginalized. And again, I like to say, even a straight white dude has three identities. And so there is a chance that you probably have one other identity that fits on this list that is an ism, which means that an identity that is discriminated against. And that is because of white supremacy, which is why we are talking about whiteness and white supremacy today. And generally, applicable advice, at least in this case, is the intent versus the impact. It's not like if you send a text message like this, you weren't intending to be a jackass or to rub it in someone's face or to make them feel hurt. It's the impact. And that's really important in talking about these issues because you're going to struggle with it forever as long as you're white and alive. And that's also how I like to address these topics in my talks as well. So, Alexa, I'm going to stop sharing and I wonder if we want to do questions.
Let's do questions. Yeah, let's do them in the chat, or if people want to raise their hands. We're a relatively small group, so however people want to go.